A wealthy woman posed as a cleaning lady while giving her maid the opportunity to take charge of her company. The shrill sound of the alarm clock echoed in the tiny apartment of Grace Morgan, pulling her out of her restless sleep. She rubbed her eyes, their deep, dark circles a testament to sleepless nights spent worrying about her mother's mounting medical bills. Grace was an unassuming woman with a quiet determination, working tirelessly as a housekeeper for some of the wealthiest families in the city. Despite her struggles, she always managed a faint smile for her ailing mother. That morning, as Grace helped her mother sip tea and adjust the blanket around her frail shoulders, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Puzzled, Grace opened the door to find Evelyn Carter, her employer, standing on the threshold. Evelyn, the CEO of a leading cosmetics empire, looked every bit the corporate powerhouse in her tailored suit and confident stance. "Good morning, Grace," Evelyn greeted, her tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mrs. Carter, is everything all right?" Grace asked, wiping her hands on her apron nervously. Evelyn hesitated, her piercing blue eyes scanning Grace's modest living room. "I have an unusual request for you," she began, stepping inside. Grace frowned. What could a woman like Evelyn possibly want from her? "I need a favor," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping slightly. "I need you to swap roles with me for one day." Grace stared, certain she'd misheard. "Swap roles?" she echoed. "Yes," Evelyn said firmly. "You'll take my place at the company while I take yours. For one day. Just 24 hours. Grace blinked, unsure whether to laugh or be offended. "But I don't know anything about running a company. I barely finished high school, Mrs. Carter." Evelyn raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "And I don't know anything about what it's like to live in your shoes." "That's precisely the point." As Evelyn explained her plan, Grace's skepticism gradually gave way to curiosity. The idea was simple. Evelyn wanted to experience the challenges of Grace's life firsthand while giving Grace an opportunity to see the corporate world. It was an experiment born from Evelyn's frustration with the growing disconnect she felt from her employees and customers. "I'll pay for your mother's treatment as part of this," Evelyn added softly, her words landing like a thunderclap in Grace's chest. The mention of her mother's health shifted something within Grace. She looked at Evelyn's determined expression, her own fear mingling with a glimmer of hope. "I'll do it," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. Evelyn smiled, relieved. "Good. Then let's get started."
That evening, Grace found herself in Evelyn's sprawling penthouse, a world away from her humble apartment. The polished marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and the air was scented with lavender and wealth. Evelyn handed her a tailored suit, a pair of sleek black heels, and a binder filled with notes.
"You'll be attending a board meeting tomorrow," Evelyn said matter-of-factly. Grace's heart sank. A meeting? She'd barely spoken in front of more than 3 people at once, let alone a room full of corporate sharks. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood in Grace's apartment, wearing a pair of faded jeans and an oversized sweater. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. She glanced around the tiny, cluttered kitchen, her polished nails tapping nervously on the counter. "This will be interesting," Evelyn murmured to herself. As both women prepared to step into each other's lives, the city outside buzzed with its usual hum of activity, unaware of the extraordinary experiment about to unfold. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Grace's modest apartment, a sharp contrast to the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Evelyn's penthouse. Evelyn stretched awkwardly in the small, creaky bed, her body unused to the firmness of the thin mattress. She could hear the soft, wheezing breaths of Grace's mother in the next room, and felt a pang of unease. This wasn't a world Evelyn knew, a world where every dollar counted, and time was always borrowed. The day began with Evelyn fumbling through Grace's morning routine. She carefully administered the medications to Grace's mother, Miss Morgan, who smiled weakly at her. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Morgan said in a frail voice. "You must be a friend of Grace's. She never leaves without making sure I'm all right." Evelyn forced a smile, her heart heavy with the realization that Grace did this every day, without complaint. The medical equipment in the corner of the room hummed softly, a reminder of the mounting bills Grace was struggling to pay. After ensuring Mrs. Morgan was settled, Evelyn picked up the cleaning supplies Grace had left for her. She had an assignment to clean a client's apartment in one of the more affluent neighborhoods. The crisp autumn air greeted Evelyn as she stepped off the subway, a stark departure from her usual chauffeured rides. The crowd bustled around her, and Evelyn felt a strange mix of anxiety and exhilaration as she navigated the unfamiliar streets. By the time she arrived at the client's apartment, her shoes were scuffed, and her carefully tied ponytail was coming loose. The door was answered by Mrs. Hargrove, a stern-looking woman in her 60s. Her sharp gaze scanned Evelyn from head to toe. "You're not Grace," Mrs. Hargrove said bluntly. "No, ma'am, covering for her today," Evelyn explained, trying to sound confident. Mrs. Hargrove's lips pursed, but she stepped aside. "Well, don't dawdle. There's plenty to do." Evelyn nodded and got to work, determined to prove herself. But it didn't take long for her to realize that the work was far harder than she'd imagined. The vacuum cleaner felt heavier with each push, and the chemical smell of cleaning products stung her nose. By the time she reached the kitchen, her arms ached, and her once immaculate shirt was damp with sweat. "You missed a spot," Mrs. Hargrove called from the living room. Evelyn clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to retort. Instead, she grabbed a rag and polished the countertop until her reflection gleamed back at her. As the hours dragged on, Evelyn grew increasingly frustrated with her own ineptitude. She spilled water while mopping, accidentally knocked over a vase, thankfully unbroken, and nearly burned her hand on the stove while trying to clean it. By the time Mrs. Hargrove inspected her work, Evelyn was exhausted and humiliated. "This isn't up to Grace's standard," Mrs. Hargrove said curtly. "I'll be calling her to let her know." "No," Evelyn blurted, panic rising. "Please don't. Grace is dealing with a lot right now. She didn't want to let you down, which is why she asked me to come." Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened slightly, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. "What's going on with Grace?" Evelyn hesitated, then decided on honesty. Her mother is very ill. She's trying to manage everything on her own: work, bills, caregiving. It's a lot. Mrs. Hargrove was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Well, I suppose I can be lenient, but don't think this means I'll tolerate shoddy work in the future." "Of course," Evelyn said, relief washing over her. As Evelyn walked back to the subway, her body ached, and her hands were raw from scrubbing. But the physical discomfort was overshadowed by a deeper realization. Grace carried these burdens every single day, without complaint, all while maintaining a quiet grace and resilience. Evelyn felt a newfound respect for her housekeeper, and a growing guilt for how little she'd appreciated her before. When Evelyn finally returned to Grace's apartment that evening, she was greeted by the sight of Miss Morgan dozing in her chair, a half-knit scarf in her lap. Evelyn smiled faintly as she draped a blanket over the older woman. Sitting in the small kitchen with a cup of tea, Evelyn stared out at the flickering streetlights, her thoughts racing. She had come into this experiment seeking perspective, but what she'd found was a window into the quiet strength and humanity that people like Grace embodied every day. "I have so much to learn," Evelyn whispered to herself. And for the first time in years, she felt both humbled and determined. The towering glass skyscraper of Parker Hall Cosmetics loomed before Grace, its sleek design a stark contrast to the small, lived-in spaces she was accustomed to. Her palms were damp as she stepped through the revolving doors, the soft hum of conversation and the clicking of heels filling her ears. Dressed in one of Evelyn's tailored suits, Grace felt like an imposter in someone else's life. A young assistant greeted her at the elevator, introducing herself as Maya. "Mrs. Parker's been delayed, so you'll be starting with the board meeting," Maya said briskly, handing Grace a sleek leather folder. "Here's the agenda. Remember, they're expecting results, not excuses." Grace swallowed hard as the elevator ascended, the soft ding of each passing floor feeling like a countdown to disaster. "You can do this." Evelyn's words echoed in her mind. "Be honest. Be yourself." The boardroom was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. A long, polished table stretched through the center, surrounded by impeccably dressed executives. Their sharp gazes fixed on Grace as she entered, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'm Grace Smith, representing Evelyn Parker today." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. An older man at the head of the table cleared his throat, his silver hair catching the light. "Where is Mrs. Parker?"
"She's attending to an urgent personal matter," Grace replied, careful to project confidence. "She's entrusted me to address today's agenda on her behalf."
The man raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "And what exactly qualifies you to represent her?" Grace hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "I've worked closely with Miss Parker for years. While I may not have her expertise, I do bring a unique perspective, one rooted in understanding the people who make this company what it is." The meeting began, and Grace quickly realized she was in over her head. The executive spoke in rapid-fire jargon, referencing charts, projections, and marketing strategies. Her head spun as she flipped through the folder, trying to follow along. When the discussion shifted to the company's recent decline in sales, Grace saw her opening. Taking a deep breath, she leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I couldn't help but notice something." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "You focused a lot on the financials, but has anyone considered why sales are declining? Could it be that our messaging feels disconnected from the people we're trying to reach? Maybe we're too focused on selling luxury instead of addressing what real customers want: products that are accessible, ethical, and inclusive." A younger executive leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you suggesting?"
Grace's confidence grew. "I'm suggesting a shift. Introduce a more affordable line of products that prioritizes sustainability and transparency. Show our customers that we care about their values, not just their wallets."
As Grace spoke, she noticed nods from a few board members. But the silver-haired man, who she now recognized as Robert Harrison, the CFO, looked unimpressed. "That's all well and good," Harrison said, his tone icy. "But can you provide any data to back up your claims?" Grace's heart sank. Data. Numbers. The very thing Evelyn had warned her to be cautious about. "I don't have the exact figures," she admitted, forcing herself to meet Harrison's gaze. "But I do know this: customers want to feel seen and valued. If we invest in understanding their needs and align our practices with their expectations, the numbers will follow." Harrison smirked. "That's a lovely sentiment, Miss Smith. But this is a business, not a charity." Grace's cheeks burned, but she stood her ground. "Business thrives on trust, Mr. Harrison. If we lose that, no amount of profit margins will save us." The room fell into a tense silence. Then, to Grace's surprise, a woman at the other end of the table spoke up. "She's right," the woman said. "The data from our focus group supports this. Customers are looking for authenticity and transparency." The meeting continued with a mix of skepticism and cautious interest. By the time it ended, Grace felt drained but oddly exhilarated. As the board members filed out, Harrison lingered, his expression unreadable.
"You handled yourself better than I expected," he said curtly. "But don't get too comfortable. This company has survived because of hard decisions, not idealism."
Grace nodded, her shoulders straight. "And maybe it's time for some of those hard decisions to include doing the right thing."
Harrison's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more before leaving the room.
The next challenge came in the form of a press interview. The company was under scrutiny for alleged unethical practices, and Grace had to face the reporters. Sitting under the harsh lights, she felt exposed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Miss Smith, what does Parker Hall Cosmetics have to say about the allegations of animal testing?" one reporter asked, her voice sharp. Grace took a deep breath. "We take these allegations very seriously," she began. "While I can't comment on specifics until the investigation is complete, I can promise this: Parker Hall is committed to transparency and ethical practices. We're inviting independent auditors to review our processes and ensure that we're holding ourselves to the highest standards." The reporters fired more questions, and Grace answered as best as she could, leaning on honesty and humility. When the interview finally ended, she felt like she'd run a marathon. That evening, as Grace returned to Evelyn's penthouse, she replayed the day's events in her mind. She had faced boardroom skeptics and relentless journalists, and though she had stumbled, she had also found her voice. As she stepped into the quiet luxury of the apartment, Grace felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. She had survived the day, but more importantly, she had stood up for what she believed in. Looking out at the glittering city skyline, Grace whispered to herself, "I can do this." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The fluorescent lights of the hospital buzzed faintly as Evelyn sat stiffly in the waiting room, her mind spinning from the events of the day. She had just spent hours at Emma's mother's bedside, navigating the confusing, emotional labyrinth of healthcare bureaucracy. The sense of helplessness gnawed at her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Her designer sneakers squeaked softly against the linoleum floor as she shifted, her thoughts jumping to Grace. "I hope she's handling things at the company," Evelyn thought, her chest tightening at the memory of her assistant's panicked face before the day began. "And I hope I didn't throw her into the deep end." The sound of hurried footsteps drew Evelyn's attention to the corridor. A nurse approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and professionalism. "Ms. Parker?" the nurse asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, standing quickly. "Mrs. Smith is stable for now. The treatment is working, but it's a long road ahead. You'll need to discuss the next steps with her primary doctor, the nurse explained. Relief flooded through Evelyn as she thanked the nurse. She took a deep breath and stepped into the small hospital room. Emma's mother lay on the bed, her frail form almost lost among the crisp white sheets. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the air. "Miss Parker," the older woman said weakly, her voice raspy. "Thank you for being here." Evelyn moved closer, her polished demeanor softening as she sat by the bedside. "You don't need to thank me, Miss Smith. Grace, your daughter, she's an incredible woman. Everything I've done today is because of her." Tears welled in Mrs. Smith's eyes. "She's my rock. She sacrificed so much for me. Sometimes I think she doesn't realize how extraordinary she is." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The woman's words struck a chord deep within her. Grace's strength, her resilience, it was a stark reminder of everything Evelyn had taken for granted in her own life. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself back at Emma's modest apartment. The day had been long, but something inside her had shifted. The polished luxury of her usual world now felt distant and hollow compared to the raw humanity she had experienced in the past 24 hours. The scent of faintly burnt toast and cheap detergent lingered in the air, and Evelyn glanced around at the small, tidy space. It was a world away from her sprawling penthouse. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quite place, a sense of grounding. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Grace. The meeting went better than expected. Facing the press was terrifying, but I stuck to our values. We need to talk. Call me when you're free. Evelyn's heart swelled with pride. Grace had faced the storm and emerged stronger. But she could also sense the underlying tension in Grace's words. She's carrying so much weight. It's time I do more. The next morning, Evelyn returned to her own world, stepping back into the pristine confines of her penthouse. Grace was waiting for her, visibly drained but standing tall. The tailored suit Evelyn had lent her was slightly wrinkled, and her hands clutched a folder tightly. "How's your mother?" Grace asked immediately. "She's stable, thanks to you," Evelyn replied, her voice warm. "And the company? How did it go?" Grace launched into a detailed recounting of her day, the board meeting, the press interview, the skeptical looks, and her impassioned defense of the company's values. As she spoke, Evelyn watched her with growing admiration. "You did better than I could have hoped," Evelyn said when Grace finished. "You handled the press, inspired the board, and set us on a new path. I'm proud of you." Grace flushed, the compliment catching her off guard. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. But I made promises, big ones. Transparency, sustainability, inclusivity. I hope I didn't overstep." Evelyn smiled. "You didn't overstep. You reminded me of what this company should stand for. And now we'll deliver on those promises. Together." For the next few hours, the two women worked side by side, reviewing the changes Grace had proposed. Evelyn was struck by Grace's insight, her ability to see the human side of the business, the employees and customers who were often reduced to numbers in quarterly reports. "You have a gift, Grace," Evelyn said suddenly, looking up from her laptop. "You see what others overlook. That's something this company desperately needs." Grace blinked, surprised. "I'm just being honest. I've spent years watching from the sidelines, hearing people's frustrations and ideas. I guess I've always wanted to make things better, but I never thought anyone would listen." "Well, I'm listening," Evelyn said firmly. "And I think you should take on a bigger role here, something beyond what you ever imagined." Grace's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you a place on the executive team," Evelyn said, her tone unwavering. "Your perspective, your values, your courage, those are exactly what we need to rebuild this company." Grace sat back, her mind reeling. The weight of the offer was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Mrs. Parker, I don't know if I'm qualified. I'm not like you." "You're not supposed to be like me," Evelyn said with a soft smile. "You're supposed to be you. And trust me, Grace, that's more than enough." The room fell silent for a moment as Grace processed the offer. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Evelyn beamed. "You won't regret this. And neither will the company." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of gold and pink, Evelyn and Grace shared a quiet moment on the penthouse balcony. The hum of traffic below and the faint chirping of birds filled the air. "Funny, isn't it?" Evelyn mused. "One day, and everything feels different." Grace nodded, her hands resting on the balcony railing, different in the best way. "Thank you for trusting me." "And thank you," Evelyn replied, "for showing me what I've been missing." As the city lights began to twinkle, The two women stood side by side, ready to face the challenges ahead together. The buzz of the office was unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. Phones rang incessantly, employees moved with purpose, and the aroma of fresh coffee wafted through the air. But the atmosphere wasn't tense, it was charged with optimism. The changes initiated during the past weeks had begun to take root, and Grace could feel it in every corner of Lewis Cosmetics. Sales are up 30%, and we've just been named one of the most ethical companies of the year, Evelyn exclaimed, walking into Grace's new office with a broad smile. Grace looked up from her desk, her face lighting up. That's incredible. I can't believe it. Believe it, Evelyn said, placing a celebratory cupcake on Grace's desk. It's because of you. Grace blushed, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. I didn't do this alone. No, but you lit the spark, Evelyn replied, pulling up a chair. You've inspired a movement within this company. People trust us again because they trust you. Grace stared out the window, taking in the sprawling cityscape. It's amazing to think how much can change in such a short time. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Short time? Grace, you've redefined what leadership looks like here. The employees feel heard, the customers see authenticity, and the board finally understands what real progress means. Grace chuckled softly. Well, it helps that I have an incredible mentor. The changes at Lewis Cosmetics were nothing short of revolutionary. The company's factories, once shrouded in secrecy, now had open-door policies for journalists and environmental activists. Supply chains were revamped to ensure ethical sourcing, and employee benefits were expanded to include mental health support and educational opportunities. Grace found herself thriving in her new role. Though she initially worried about the learning curve, her genuine care for people and her unflinching honesty set her apart. She visited factory floors regularly, speaking with employees and listening to their concerns. You know, Evelyn said one afternoon as she watched Grace interact with workers, you've done something I couldn't. Grace tilted her head curiously. What's that? You've shown them that leadership isn't about being perfect or untouchable. It's about being real, Evelyn said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Beyond the company's success, Grace's personal life was also changing for the better. Her mother's health continued to improve, thanks to the treatment Evelyn had funded. The once cluttered hospital room was now filled with laughter as Grace shared stories of her new role with her recovering mother. You've always been destined for great things, Grace, her mother said one afternoon, her voice stronger than it had been in months. I'm so proud of you. Grace squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You've been my strength through everything. One evening, Evelyn invited Grace to her penthouse for dinner. The mood was relaxed, the city lights twinkling outside as the two women shared stories of their journeys. Do you remember the day I asked you to switch places with me? Evelyn asked, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully. Grace laughed. How could I forget? I thought you were out of your mind. Evelyn grinned. Maybe I was, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. Grace raised her glass. Here's to risks, then. To risks, Evelyn echoed, clinking her glass with Grace's. They both sat back, a comfortable silence settling between them. The once impossible partnership had evolved into something far greater, a deep and abiding friendship built on mutual respect and shared vision. Months later, Lewis Cosmetics announced the launch of a groundbreaking product line, an affordable, sustainable range designed for inclusivity and environmental responsibility. The launch event was held in the heart of the city, with both Evelyn and Grace taking the stage together. Today, we're not just launching a product, Evelyn said, her voice resonating with pride. We're launching a promise, a commitment to our values and to every person who believes in what we stand for. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. This company taught me that true leadership isn't about standing above others. It's about standing with them. Together, we've proven that change is possible, and this is only the beginning. The crowd erupted into applause as the two women stood side by side, their smiles reflecting the hard-fought victories that had brought them to this moment. Later that evening, back at the office, Evelyn and Grace sat by the large window, watching the city below. The hum of traffic mixed with the occasional burst of laughter from employees still celebrating the day's success. I used to think my life was perfect, Evelyn said, breaking the comfortable silence. But I didn't realize how much I was missing until I walked in your shoes. Grace smiled, her gaze fixed on the city lights. And I never thought I'd be capable of this. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. Evelyn reached out, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. We both learned something important, the power of perspective. As the city buzzed with life around them, the two women raised their glasses in a silent toast. They had come from different worlds, faced unimaginable challenges, and emerged stronger together. Their journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next, armed with empathy, determination, and the unshakable bond of their partnership.